Hello and welcome to the Unseen Question. The question of whether there was an ancient Palestine isn't just about geography, it's about identity, memory, and power. When we ask if there was an ancient Palestine, we're not only asking about maps and borders, we're asking about who gets to define the past and whose story becomes official. The phrase ancient Palestine tends to provoke strong reactions. Some insist that Palestine never existed until the 20th century. Others argue it has roots stretching back thousands of years. But both positions oversimplify a complex history, because what we call Palestine wasn't always a state, but it was always a place, a real region, inhabited by real people. If you look at ancient texts, the earliest use of a word resembling Palestine comes from the Greek Palestine, a term used by writers like Herodotus in the 5th century BCE. He described a stretch of land between Phoenicia and Egypt, roughly corresponding to today's Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. That's over 2,500 years ago, long before the modern conflicts or political entities we argue about today. But Herodotus wasn't naming a new invention. He was describing a region already known for its diverse peoples: Canaanites, Philistines, Hebrews, and others. In ancient times, names shifted constantly. Empires came and went, but the land remained. People called it Canaan, Philistia, Judea, Syria, Palestina. Yet beneath each label, there was continuity, human settlement, culture, trade, and struggle. When the Romans crushed the Jewish revolts in the 2nd century CE, they renamed the province Syria Palestina. That act is often portrayed as Rome's attempt to erase Jewish identity from the land. And yes, it was partly that, but it also reflected the Roman practice of reorganizing territories under familiar geographic names. The word Palestina itself wasn't invented by Rome. It already existed. The Romans just used it officially. So, did an ancient Palestine exist? The answer depends on what you mean by exist. If you mean a modern-style nation-state with borders, passports, and sovereignty, no, it didn't. But neither did Israel, or Egypt, or Greece in the modern sense. The idea of nation-states didn't even exist yet. What did exist were cultural regions, shared economies, and overlapping communities bound by trade routes, religion, and empire. The land known today as Palestine was one of those regions, a crossroads where languages, gods, and empires collided. It was never isolated. It was always plural, always layered. Archaeology confirms this. Excavations show cities like Jericho, Gaza, Ashkelon, and Jaffa continuously inhabited for thousands of years. Different peoples built atop one another's ruins. Canaanite temples became Philistine fortresses, which became Israelite towns, which became Roman cities. History here is not a straight line, it's sediment. When people say there was no ancient Palestine, what they usually mean is that there was no sovereign kingdom called Palestine. But that's a narrow way to view history. By that logic, there was no ancient Europe either, just tribes and city-states. The label changes, but the land and its inhabitants do not vanish. Palestine as a name endured because it described a region that mattered, strategically, economically, and culturally. It sat between the ancient powers of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Every conqueror passed through it, from the Assyrians to the Ottomans. Each empire gave it new names, but none erased its identity completely. The biblical writers spoke of the Philistines, a seafaring people who settled along the southern coast. Their territory, Philistia, is the root of the later name Palestine. Ironically, the same texts that condemned them preserved their memory, and through them the name survived. By the time of the early Christian era, Palestine was a familiar term to Greeks and Romans alike. Early church fathers used it routinely. So did Byzantine geographers and Arab scholars after them. Muslim historians, centuries later, referred to Palestine as one of the administrative districts under Islamic rule, centered around cities like Jerusalem and Ramla. This isn't the invention of modern politics. It's a continuity of usage. It's the same way India referred to a vast and varied region long before it became a modern nation. The name pointed to a land, not to a single government. There's also a psychological layer to this discussion. The denial of ancient Palestine isn't just about correcting history. It's often about controlling it. When people claim something never existed, they're not just making a factual statement. They're staking a claim to legitimacy. To say a people had no ancient presence is to say their roots are shallow, their belonging conditional. But archaeology doesn't work that way. History isn't a contest for ownership. The Canaanites, the Hebrews, the Philistines, the Nabateans, they all lived in overlapping timeframes, traded with each other, fought, intermarried. The ancient Near East was not divided by modern identities. No one carried a passport that said Jew or Palestinian. Those labels evolved centuries later. Still, the emotional weight behind the question, was there an ancient Palestine, makes sense. It's not just academic. It's about modern narratives, about who was there first, who has rights now, and who history favors. That's why archaeology, which should be objective, often becomes political. Because ruins can't speak, and whoever interprets them gets to decide what they mean. If you walk through ancient sites in the region today, you'll find layers of civilizations stacked like pages in a lost library. The same hill might contain a Bronze Age shrine, a Roman amphitheater, a Byzantine church, and an Islamic fort. Which of those layers gets emphasized depends on who's telling the story. In modern discourse, some insist that Palestine was a colonial invention, a British creation after World War I. But long before the British, maps, coins, and texts referred to the region by that name. The 2nd century Roman maps labeled it Palestina. Early Islamic geographers used Jund Philastin. Even medieval European pilgrims spoke of traveling through Palestine. It's worth asking, why does this matter so much? Because the fight over history often mirrors the fight over existence. Erase a name, and you weaken a people's claim to the land. Deny the past, and you rewrite the present. The historical record doesn't suggest that Palestine was ever made up, but it does show that it was always shared. No single group ever held it forever. Each empire claimed it, each left its mark, and each eventually fell. The people who remained adapted, mixed, survived. That's the uncomfortable truth of human history. Borders shift, myths harden, and identities evolve. The question isn't whether Palestine existed, but why we keep pretending that history can be neatly divided between us and them. The archaeological evidence from sites like Tel es-Sultan, Megiddo, and Gaza reveals cultural overlap rather than clear separation. Pottery styles blend, languages borrow from each other. Religions evolve side by side. That's what human history looks like when it's not filtered through ideology. In the end, ancient Palestine wasn't a country. It was a continuum, a landscape shaped by its geography and its people. The ancient world didn't need modern nationalism to define belonging. People were defined by their city, their tribe, their trade, or their temple, not by the color of a flag. Over time, religion would step in to solidify those fluid identities. The Hebrew Bible gave the land divine significance. Later, Christianity and Islam layered on their own sacred geographies. But the soil itself, the hills, the valleys, the rivers, they didn't care who prayed on them. Today, when people debate whether ancient Palestine existed, they're really arguing over narrative ownership. It's less about archaeology and more about legitimacy, about whose story gets to frame the moral landscape. But history doesn't need sides, it only needs honesty. The existence of ancient Palestine is a fact of geography and human continuity, not of nationalism or theology. It was there, inhabited, named and remembered, long before any of us tried to weaponize its past. To deny that is to deny the complexity of human history itself. And maybe that's the deeper point here, that we, as humans, struggle to accept that no land, no culture, and no belief is born in isolation. Everything we are is built on what came before, and what came before Palestine and what followed is a reminder that identity is never a static thing. It evolves, like the land itself, shifting beneath every empire, every faith, every claim. So, was there an ancient Palestine? Yes, not as a flag or a throne or a singular people, but as a place where countless lives unfolded, where history didn't belong to anyone because it belonged to everyone. And maybe that's why it still matters, because the more we argue about whose story is true, the further we drift from the truth itself. Because the land was always real, it's the stories that keep changing. The survival of the name Palestine across millennia is one of those quiet facts that complicate every modern debate. It wasn't preserved through conquest or through religion, but through language, through habit, through geography that refused to forget itself. When the Romans called the area Syria Palestina, they were working within a long-established naming system, one that tied regions to familiar cultural references. The term linked back to the ancient Philistines, who had lived on the coastal plain centuries earlier. But by the Roman era, the Philistines as a people were long gone. The name endured, detached from ethnicity, and became purely geographic. That's how most ancient place names survived, not as political statements, but as linguistic fossils. The name Palestine was never the property of a single group. It was descriptive, like Arabia or Mesopotamia. It simply told you where you were, the land between desert and sea, between Egypt and Syria, between empires. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the region remained under Byzantine control for centuries, and Palestine continued to appear in administrative titles: Palestina Prima, Palestina Secunda, Palestina Tertia. The Byzantine bureaucracy didn't erase the name, they used it daily. The word had become ordinary. When the Muslim conquests swept through the Near East in the 7th century, the new rulers didn't erase the name either. Arabic sources adopted it naturally. Palestine. It became one of the administrative districts of the early caliphate, a jund or military district, alongside others like Jund al-Urdun, Jordan, and Jund Damascus. The capital of Jund Palestine was Ramla, not Jerusalem, which shows that the region's identity was never centered on one sacred city. It was a functioning province, part of a living, organized world. Over the following centuries, Palestine remained a recognizable region in the Islamic world. Scholars wrote about it, poets celebrated it, travelers described it. The name persisted on coins, in records, and in geography manuals. If you lived in Damascus or Cairo in the 10th century and someone said they were from Palestine, you'd know exactly where that was. It wasn't mythical. It was familiar. This continuity matters because it undercuts the idea that Palestine was invented by outsiders. Names don't survive by accident. They survive because generations keep using them, and they mean something beyond politics. They're part of how people locate themselves in the world. By the time European crusaders arrived in the 11th century, they too referred to the region as Palestina. Medieval maps from Christian Europe show Terra Sancta Palestina, the Holy Land of Palestine. The Crusaders didn't create that label, they inherited it. They used it interchangeably with the Holy Land because it was already the established term. Later, under Ottoman rule, the area was divided into administrative units that didn't match the exact borders of earlier times. But even then, the name Palestine continued to appear in writings and correspondence. In the 19th century, Western travelers, geographers, and archaeologists used Palestine as a matter of course, not because of nationalism, but because it was simply what the region had always been called. This long linguistic thread is what makes the modern erasure attempt so transparent. To say Palestine never existed is to treat history like a chessboard, where pieces can be removed and replaced without consequence. But the land doesn't reset when empires fall, and human memory doesn't stop when power shifts. History doesn't care about the slogans of today. It only records what people actually did and said, and they kept saying Palestine. It's also revealing to see how the modern argument over the term mirrors older struggles over sacred geography. Throughout history, religion has claimed ownership of land by rewriting its story. The Jewish Bible rebranded Canaan as the Promised Land. Christianity reimagined it as the stage of divine revelation. Islam sanctified it as Al-Ard al-Muqaddasa, the Holy Land of Islam. Each faith laid spiritual claim, layering meaning upon meaning, until the real people living there became background characters in a theological drama. The name Palestine, in contrast, was secular, geographic, indifferent to divine narratives, and maybe that's why it survived, because it belonged to everyone and no one at once. Even so, history has a way of being rewritten by whoever holds the pen. After World War I, when Britain took control of the area under the Mandate system, they didn't invent Palestine. They readopted it. The League of Nations documents from the 1920s officially refer to the territory as Palestine, because that's what it had already been called for centuries. British administrators didn't revive a myth. They followed precedent. What changed wasn't the name, it was the politics attached to it. As nationalism spread across the 20th century, names that once described geography became flags of identity, and Palestine shifted from a region into a people. That transformation wasn't unique. It's what happened to India, Egypt, Greece, and countless others. Nations are, in many ways, modern inventions built atop ancient landscapes, and yet the denial of Palestine's antiquity remains popular among certain political and religious groups because it serves a purpose. It simplifies the story. If Palestine was never ancient, then it's easier to argue that it was always someone else's, that it has no historical legitimacy. But that argument only works if you treat history as property, as something that can be owned rather than understood. Archaeologists know better. The soil doesn't lie. When you dig into the ancient strata of Gaza, you find Philistine pottery, Egyptian amulets, Hellenistic coins, Roman mosaics, Islamic inscriptions. The layers blend. There is no single point where this people ends and that people begins. The land was shared, contested, traded, and transformed continuously. That's the real history, not of ownership, but of coexistence and collision. It's uncomfortable to many because it refuses to offer simple heroes and villains. But that's the truth of the ancient world. It wasn't divided into nations or faiths. It was a web of cultures, constantly overlapping. Even the languages tell the story. The Hebrew Peleshe, the Greek Palestine, the Latin Palestina, the Arabic Philistine. all versions of the same root, passed down across centuries. Words evolve, but their meaning endures. You can change rulers, but you can't fully erase the name of a place that has existed in human memory for 3,000 years. It's almost poetic. The more the name was suppressed or redefined, the more it persisted, because reality has a way of outlasting ideology. In modern times, the argument over whether there was an ancient Palestine isn't really about the past. It's about the present. It's about how people justify power, about how identity is anchored in history. If you can convince the world that a people never existed, you can more easily convince them that their suffering doesn't matter. That's why the question is never neutral. It's not a matter of trivia. It's a moral question disguised as historical curiosity. So what do we know? We know the name is ancient. We know the people were real. We know the land was inhabited, named, and recorded in countless documents over thousands of years. We know that maps, travelers, and empires recognized it. And we know that its erasure is recent, deliberate, and ideological. When we strip away the modern rhetoric, what remains is simple. There was always a land called Palestine, even when its borders changed, even when its rulers changed. It existed as a living region in human consciousness. And maybe that's the deeper irony, that in trying to erase the idea of Palestine, modern politics has only made it more visible. The debate itself keeps the word alive. Every argument, every denial, every map redrawn, all of it reminds us that the name refuses to die. History has this quiet defiance built into it. It resists control. So yes, there was an ancient Palestine, not a nation, but a name, not a myth, but a memory. And memory, once it enters language, is nearly impossible to erase. What this teaches us isn't just about one place. It's about how all civilizations work. Every culture is built on others. Every border is temporary. Every name is an echo of something older. And that's the uncomfortable truth that ideologies, religious or political, don't like to face, that nothing in human history belongs to one people forever. The land outlives the stories told about it. It always does. Because in the end, it's not the maps or empires that endure. It's the names whispered across time, the ones carried by traders, travelers, and storytellers. Names like Palestine, a name older than kingdoms, older than crusades, older than any flag flying over it today. A name that proves history cannot be owned, only remembered. And even when people try to bury that memory under politics or faith, the truth still breathes just beneath the surface, waiting to be unearthed again. The modern story of Palestine is inseparable from its ancient one. Because what happened over the past century isn't a new struggle. It's the latest chapter in an ongoing pattern, the same land, the same tug of war between identity and power, just with new languages, new flags, and new justifications. When European powers began dividing the remnants of the Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century, they didn't inherit empty land. They inherited centuries of culture and history layered together. Yet in the colonial mindset, history wasn't something to preserve. It was something to reshape. The British Mandate for Palestine, established in 1920, used the name Palestine formally, but not with the goal of affirming its identity. Rather, it was a convenient term to manage a territory between Egypt and Syria. The British officials who drew those lines often treated the region as a puzzle piece, not a home. They weren't thinking of history, they were thinking of strategy. Still, the term Palestine re-entered global consciousness through this period. It became official again, printed on coins, stamps, and passports. The people who lived there, Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike, were identified as Palestinians under the Mandate. The word meant something. Geographical, not yet nationalist, but that meaning was about to change. As Zionism rose in Europe, propelled by centuries of persecution and the trauma of statelessness, Jewish immigrants began to arrive in large numbers. Their goal wasn't just to find refuge, it was to rebuild an ancient homeland. But here's where history began to repeat its old paradox. One people's dream can become another's displacement. The narrative that justified the new project often leaned on the idea that Palestine had never truly existed, that it was an empty land or a vague backwater. The phrase, "a land without a people for a people without a land," became a rallying cry, even though it was never true. The land had always been inhabited, cultivated, lived in. Its villages old enough to have seen empires rise and fall before Europe even knew what the word nation meant. This myth of emptiness wasn't new. Colonial powers had used the same logic in the Americas, in Australia, in Africa. It's easier to take a place if you can first convince yourself it was never really anyone's to begin with, and easier to dismiss resistance if you convince others that the people resisting don't exist. History was rewritten again, not with swords this time, but with language. The ancient name Palestine, which had survived millennia, was suddenly recast as an invention, an afterthought, a political fiction. region. But the irony is that this rewriting only exposed how powerful the name really was. You don't erase something that doesn't matter. The very effort to deny Palestine's existence proves that it had one. In the mid-20th century, as decolonization movements swept across Asia and Africa, the Palestinian identity hardened, no longer just geographic but national. The term Palestinian came to describe a distinct people bound not only by shared culture and history, but by a shared erasure. When others said they had no past, they began reclaiming it, and they didn't have to invent that past. It was already there, preserved in records, traditions, and the continuity of the name itself. In old European maps from the 1700s, you'll see Palestine clearly labeled. In medieval Islamic texts, Palestine is described as a region of orchards and markets. Even the earliest Christian pilgrims, centuries before the Crusades, wrote of Palestina in their travel logs. The name never disappeared, it only went quiet until politics forced it back into conversation. This is where history and psychology intersect. Denying someone's past is one of the most effective ways to control their present. It isolates them in time. It tells them they have no roots, no legitimacy, no story of their own. And that's precisely what modern debates about ancient Palestine are designed to do. But truth has a stubborn way of surviving because it doesn't depend on belief. Archaeological layers, manuscripts, and linguistic continuity tell the same story, regardless of ideology. Palestine existed as a region, a name, and a cultural crossroads long before nationalism and long before any modern claim tried to overwrite it. What makes the discussion even more revealing is how both ancient and modern erasures follow the same logic. The Romans renamed Judea, Syria, Palestina to assert control after crushing rebellion. Modern powers, centuries later, manipulate history for the same reason, to control narrative, justify expansion, and define belonging. It's the same impulse, the belief that by renaming, you can rewrite reality. But names have memories. They carry traces of every tongue that spoke them. Throughout the Ottoman period, for example, the people of the region referred to themselves by village, city, or family, but also collectively as Ahl Filastin, the people of Palestine. Ottoman tax records use the word Filastin for centuries, not as a nationalist label, but as an administrative and geographic one. Then came the British, who claimed to bring order, but instead layered a new confusion. They kept the old name, but introduced new divisions. For the first time, identity was tied to paper, passports, deeds, census lists. That's when Palestine stopped being just a place and started being a question. By the 1940s, that question turned into a crisis, and by 1948, into catastrophe. The Nakba, the displacement of over 700,000 Palestinians, didn't just erase villages, it erased histories. Families that could trace their roots back centuries suddenly became refugees without documents, without land, without a name recognized by the world. And yet, the name endured. It reappeared in the voices of the displaced, in the records of the UN, in songs, poems, and protests. The people who had been told they had no ancient past began reclaiming it through memory and scholarship, digging back through the centuries to show that their roots were not only real, but old. If you look closely, history moves in circles. The same strategies repeat, renaming, rewriting, reframing, but always against the grain of reality. The land never stops existing. The people never stop remembering. It's worth asking why this pattern repeats. Why do powerful groups try so hard to erase older names, older stories? Because history, when left intact, makes domination harder. When people know their past, they resist easier. And when a name connects across thousands of years, it becomes a kind of evidence that no one can fully destroy. That's why every empire in history has tried to control the story of the places it conquers. The Romans did it, the Crusaders did it, the British did it, and today, the struggle continues not just on the ground, but in the way history is told. You can see it in modern textbooks, in the selective way maps are drawn. Sometimes the name Palestine vanishes from maps altogether, replaced by neutral terms like the region or the territory, as if saying the word itself is too political. But refusing to name something doesn't erase it. It only reveals fear, because language carries power, and Palestine is one of those words that carries an entire history inside it. You can feel the centuries in its syllables. When people today argue that there was no ancient Palestine, they're really saying that only certain histories deserve to count, that history begins when power begins. But that's not how the past works. The earth keeps its own records, in stone, in pottery, in the unbroken line of human habitation. And the record shows that Palestine, whatever you call it, has always been there, under different empires, under different names, but always there. It's not a myth, it's geography, it's continuity. And that's the strange beauty of this truth, that even if the world stopped saying the name, the land would still whisper it through its layers. Every ruin, every inscription, every layer of ash tells a story older than the arguments. In a way, asking, was there an ancient Palestine, is like asking whether history itself is real, because if a place so well documented, so continuously inhabited, can be declared non-existent by modern politics, then anything can be erased. That's why this question matters, not just for one region, but for how we treat truth. History isn't a weapon to be wielded, it's a record to be protected. And when we protect it, we protect our shared humanity. Palestine existed, in stone, in memory, in the words passed from one tongue to another, not as a kingdom carved in borders, but as a place where people lived, dreamed, and died. That's all a place needs to exist. And that's what the ancient world understood. That identity isn't about possession, it's about presence. The ancient Palestine that people debate today isn't an invention, it's a reminder that land can hold stories longer than empires, and that truth can survive even when no one wants to hear it. Because every time someone denies that it was ever real, history itself quietly answers back. It was. The struggle over Palestine today isn't only about borders or politics, it's about the right to remember, because when history becomes dangerous to power, memory becomes an act of resistance. What we see playing out in our time, the denial, the rewriting, the selective archaeology, is not new. Every empire has tried to make its rule look eternal by rewriting the story of those who came before, and every time, the truth eventually resurfaces. The ancient name Palestine survived through centuries of conquest because it didn't belong to one ruler or one faith. It existed in the common tongue, in trade routes, in correspondence, in everyday speech. The same word traveled from Egyptian hieroglyphs to Greek manuscripts, to Roman decrees, to Arabic chronicles. It moved through time like a quiet thread that no one could fully cut. That's how real history survives, not through monuments, but through language, through the words people keep using even when power changes hands. And that's what makes this story so revealing. Modern arguments about whether Palestine existed are often political disguises for something much deeper. They expose how uncomfortable we are with complexity. We want the past to fit neatly into modern frameworks, to pick a side, to confirm a belief. But history isn't moral or ideological, it's just real. The people who lived on that land thousands of years ago weren't thinking about future borders or national identities. They were farming, trading, building, worshipping, burying their dead. They were living human lives, and that's enough to make them part of history. When someone insists that ancient Palestine didn't exist, what they're really doing is narrowing the definition of existence, reducing history to whatever fits their version of ownership. But the past doesn't need permission to exist, and the proof of that is everywhere. In the ruins of ancient Gaza, in the streets of Jerusalem, where Canaanite foundations sit beneath Roman stones, beneath Crusader arches, beneath Ottoman markets. History in this region doesn't replace itself. It accumulates, layer upon layer. That's the truth that neither religion nor nationalism can erase. The idea that one people can completely erase another's presence is not only false, it's impossible. The evidence of coexistence is written into the ground itself. But there's another layer here, a psychological one. The need to deny Palestine's antiquity reveals something about how humans handle history. When identity becomes sacred, truth becomes negotiable. And when belonging is built on exclusivity, the past becomes a threat. That's why ancient Palestine has become such a battleground of memory. It's not about archaeology, it's about legitimacy, about who gets to claim continuity and who gets cast as temporary. But history doesn't play favorites, it keeps receipts for everyone. The ancient world was never as divided as modern politics makes it out to be. People moved, traded, intermarried, adopted each other's languages and gods. Cultures overlapped. The region we now call Palestine was one of the earliest melting pots, not an isolated kingdom, but a living crossroad. In many ways, that's what made it powerful, and what made it threatening to those who needed history to be simple. Because if you accept that ancient Palestine existed, then you have to accept that the past wasn't as black and white as modern narratives demand. You have to accept that multiple peoples shared the same space, that no one story can own the land. And maybe that's what makes this question so explosive even today. Because to admit the existence of ancient Palestine is to admit that history cannot be monopolized. It's to admit that the land never belonged to one people alone, and that every empire, every faith, every ideology that claimed it was only passing through. That's not a comfortable truth, but it's the honest one. History has a kind of moral gravity to it. It pulls everything back toward reality eventually. You can deny it for a time, but the weight of evidence, the texts, the maps, the continuity of names, always brings the truth back up to the surface. You can see it in small details. Ancient coins stamped with Palestina, early Islamic records describing Philistine as a province of lush farmland and bustling cities, Christian bishops calling themselves of Palestine in church documents, Jewish writings referencing their neighbors in Peleshet, different languages, same root, same land. This is what historians mean when they say the past is plural. There isn't one Palestine. There are many, overlapping in time and meaning. The land existed before the labels, and it will exist after them. Even today, the fight over its memory continues. You'll see maps that avoid using the word, institutions that shy away from it, governments that treat it like a forbidden term, and yet the word persists, spoken, written, sung, because names that are true never really die. There's something deeply human about that persistence. It shows how memory itself can outlast erasure, how people, when stripped of everything, still hold on to words, because words are the last form of ownership they can't be taken from. And that's why it's not just about the land, it's about identity, about how a people refuses to be defined out of existence. If you look at the arc of history, every attempt to erase Palestine has backfired. The Romans renamed Judea to suppress rebellion, and in doing so gave the world a name that would endure for millennia. The British turned Palestine into an administrative term and ended up reviving its historical visibility. Modern efforts to erase the name only make it louder. It's as if the land itself insists on remembering what others try to forget. And maybe that's the lesson buried beneath all the centuries of conflict. The truth isn't something you can win. It's something you either recognize or deny, but it doesn't depend on you. The existence of ancient Palestine is one of those truths, not because it fits a modern narrative, but because it's the simplest explanation of the evidence. It was there, it was named, it was inhabited, and it was remembered. Every attempt to erase it, ancient or modern, only confirms its reality, because if something truly never existed, no one would need to spend centuries denying it. The deeper question, then, isn't whether ancient Palestine existed. It's why so many people are still afraid to admit that it did. Maybe it's because acknowledging it means accepting that history belongs to everyone, that no belief or border can fully contain it, that human stories overlap, contradict, and continue. And maybe that's the hardest truth of all, that we are not the authors of the past, only its inheritors. The land we call Palestine has worn many names: Canaan, Philistia, Judea, Syria, Palestina, Philistin, the Holy Land, each one a chapter in a story that no single culture can claim. Its history is not a myth, but a mosaic, and like all mosaics, its beauty comes from the fragments, from how they fit together. To deny that is to deny the complexity of what it means to be human, because in the end, what matters isn't whether we call it Palestine, or Canaan, or anything else. What matters is that the land has always been lived in, remembered, and named. That continuity of presence, of memory, of language is what makes something real. So when someone asks, was there an ancient Palestine? The answer is quiet but certain. Yes, there was, and there still is, not just in the earth, but in the memory of humanity itself. Because you can bury ruins, you can silence people, you can redraw maps, but you cannot erase what time has already recorded, and time has already spoken. There was an ancient Palestine, and it has never truly disappeared.